When I first joined Blackwood Asylum as an intern, I thought it would be an ordinary experience. A large facility with patients requiring intensive care, overseen by experienced medical staff. Nothing truly frightened me until that day came. That morning, my supervisor gave me an additional task. A new patient was arriving, and I had to ensure his admission process went smoothly. I read his file before he arrived. Victor Langley. The name wasn't entirely unfamiliar, though I couldn't remember why. The deeper I read, the clearer it became. A man diagnosed with severe psychosis, found with his wife's remains inside their home freezer. The police reported that he admitted to enjoying human flesh, calling it a sensory delight. When he finally arrived, 4 security officers escorted him, bound in thick iron chains. His arms were shackled behind his back, his legs restrained, and a metal mask covered his mouth. Maximum security measures were enforced. His head hung low, his unkempt hair falling over his pale face. His body was emaciated, as if he hadn't eaten in a long time. A strange unease crawled up my spine. As he passed me, he tilted his head slightly, and for a moment our eyes met. His gaze was empty, but there was something lurking within it, like a predator watching its prey. That night, I was assigned to conduct a routine inspection in his ward, Ward D, the maximum security zone. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a sudden blackout. This wasn't uncommon, but something felt different this time. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately, yet for a few seconds, the corridor was plunged into absolute darkness. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, a dim red glow bathed the hallway, making everything look even more eerie. I switched on my flashlight and began walking down the corridor. Each cell door had a small window, allowing staff to check inside without opening the door. When I arrived at cell number 333, I peeked inside. The room appeared empty. I shone my flashlight into the dark corners, searching for him. As my light shifted to the center of the room, his face suddenly appeared behind the glass. I instinctively took a step back, my breath caught. His smile widened, revealing his yellowed teeth. I stared at him for a moment, then decided to continue my task. But before I could take another step, a loud noise erupted from inside the cell, the sound of a head slamming against the glass, again and again. The reinforced glass began to show faint cracks. His raspy voice filled the hallway. I reached out to press the alarm button on the wall, but before my fingers could touch it, a soft click came from behind me. I turned around, and my blood ran cold. The door to cell number 333 was slightly open. That should have been impossible. The security system had a double lock that wouldn't disengage even during a power outage. Victor Langley stood there, his head peeking through the gap, his gaze sharp and dangerous. My body froze. I knew I had to run, but my legs refused to move. He stepped forward slowly, his arms hanging limply like a broken puppet. His mouth moved soundlessly, as if whispering something I couldn't hear. But as he drew closer, his voice finally reached my ears, soft like a nightmare's whisper. I turned and ran as fast as I could. The long corridor felt narrower with every step, the shadows from my flashlight flickering across the walls. I reached my office and slammed my hand against the alarm button, my fingers trembling. The power came back on, and a deafening alarm blared through the halls. Security staff rushed toward Ward D. When they arrived at cell number 333, all they found were open handcuffs and iron chains lying on the floor. There was no sign of Victor Langley. They searched the entire facility, but he had vanished as if swallowed by the darkness. The following investigation found no evidence of how he had escaped. The security footage only showed his cell standing empty minutes before the alarm went off. There was no recording of how he got out, as if he had never been there at all. I never found out how he escaped or where he went, but since that night, I haven't slept peacefully. In the darkness, I always feel like someone is watching. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding, and in the dim corner of my room, I see a thin shadow, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and a whisper that seeps into my mind. Eyeballs, always wet, easy to swallow. Last year, I started working as a night shift janitor at a psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania that had been operating for decades. The place wasn't very big, housing only about 50 patients, but it had a reputation for being haunted among the locals. Every night, there were 3 staff members on duty, me, a nurse named Sarah, and a security guard named Daniel. However, that night, I was informed that Daniel wasn't coming in. That meant it was just me and Sarah watching over the vast, eerie building until morning. I had worked night shifts before, so it wasn't new to me, but that night felt quieter than usual. Around 11 p.m., I was mopping the floor in the main hallway when Sarah suddenly appeared, her face pale. "Did you see someone pass by here just now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "No, why?" She let out a nervous sigh. "I just saw someone standing in front of the medication room, but when I went over, they were gone." I knew this hospital had many patients with mental disorders, but the medication room was supposed to be securely locked, and no patient could enter it alone. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and went back to work. By around 2 a.m., I had finished my tasks and decided to find Sarah to ask if there was anything else I could do. I walked through the silent hallways, passing patient rooms with their doors firmly shut. There was no sign of Sarah anywhere. I checked the nurse's station, the medical supply room, and even the staff break room, but she was nowhere to be found. I started feeling uneasy when I noticed her notes were still open on the desk, with a pen lying on top of them, as if she had left in a hurry. I tried calling her, but my calls went straight to voicemail. A creeping sense of dread washed over me. I stepped outside into the hospital's backyard, hoping to find Sarah there. The dim lights illuminated a small garden with old benches that were rarely used. As I walked around, my eyes caught something on the ground, an ID badge. I bent down and picked it up. It was Sarah's. At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The atmosphere grew heavier, and I felt like someone was watching me from the darkness. Without a second thought, I ran back inside the hospital and immediately called the police. When the police arrived and checked the CCTV footage, chills ran down my spine at what we saw. Sarah wasn't hallucinating. The camera had captured the figure of a man dressed like a hospital patient, moving strangely, creeping through the hallways. Half an hour after Sarah spoke to me, the man appeared behind her, covered her mouth, and dragged her into the basement. I felt sick. I had no idea that just meters away from me, Sarah was being abducted. The police searched the hospital and eventually found a door leading to an old, abandoned underground corridor. There, at the end of the dark, dusty hallway, they found Sarah. Tied up, her mouth gagged with cloth. The man was nowhere to be found. After that incident, I decided to quit my job there. The police said the man was likely a former patient who was never officially recorded in the system, someone who had been living in the shadows of the hospital, unnoticed by anyone, and to this day, he has never been found. This happened when I was 22, during my internship as a nurse at an old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city. The place had stood for decades, its large, dimly lit halls filled with the scent of antiseptic mixed with something older, something rotten. I was assigned to the long-term inpatient ward, where those deemed unfit to return to society were cared for indefinitely. My first day went smoothly until I met a patient named Daryl. Daryl was a man in his 30s, bald-headed, with eyes that seemed too large for his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like someone who rarely saw the sun. He didn't speak much, only staring with a small smile that never left his lips. A senior nurse warned me to be careful around him. "He has a habit of clinging to new people," one of the nurses whispered. "Don't get too close." I brushed it off as just another routine warning and tried to remain professional. During dinner, Daryl sat alone in the corner, but I could feel his eyes following my every move. When it was time to hand out medication, I approached him. He greeted me with a slightly wider smile. "You're new here," he said softly. I nodded, handing him his pills. "Yeah, I'm an intern here." He let out a quiet chuckle, almost like a whisper. "Don't stay too long. You won't like what happens next." I ignored him and continued my shift. But that night, as I was getting ready to leave, I received a message from an unknown number. "Look behind you." I turned around immediately. There was no one there, just the dimly lit hospital hallway filled with the eerie shadows of old furniture. I exhaled sharply and hurried out of the building. Later that night, as I was home in my apartment, my doorbell rang. I froze. No one ever visited without letting me know first. Cautiously, I peeked through the peephole. No one was there, just the empty corridor outside my apartment. But as I turned away, my phone vibrated again. Another message from the unknown number. "I can see you." My heart pounded. I checked my door again, making sure it was locked. I tried calling my hospital supervisor, but no one answered. After a while, I forced myself to calm down and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I arrived early at the hospital and told a senior nurse about what had happened. She gave me a strange look. "Daryl doesn't have access to a phone," she said. "He's not even allowed near technology." I felt uneasy, but I tried to push it aside. That night, however, when I returned home, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Someone had scratched words into my door with something sharp. "Don't stay too long." I quit my internship the next day. A few months later, I heard that Daryl had been transferred to another facility. The reason? Several nurses reported seeing him standing in the dark storage room for medical equipment, talking to himself, or maybe to something we couldn't see.